Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, welcome. Welcome to you all to this lecture by Professor Achim Venman, who will deal with the evolving landscape of peace diplomacy. I'm Gilles Carbonnier. I'm a professor of international development economics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and it's my pleasure to moderate the session. And it's also my pleasure to extend you all a warm welcome for all of you here in the room, but also for the colleagues who join us online. And herzlich willkommen to the group of students from the the German School of Geneva. It's a pleasure to have you also with us. Where are the peacemakers? Assessing the state of peace diplomacy. I think that this title couldn't be so timely, not only because of the very busy weekend in Geneva with, as you know, the Ukrainian delegation meeting the US delegation in the US permanent mission in Geneva for peace conversations, but also meeting EU, European emissaries in the Hotel Continental. But I think that it is also extremely timely, not just because of what happened during the weekend, but also because we see a multiplication in the number and intensity of armed conflicts. Many of those conflicts are protracted with no peace in sight. And indeed, it's a moment which is so important to reflect and reconsider how to be more successful, how to have effective peace diplomacy, which is so much needed. Professor Achim Venman will share his reflection just about a year after he took the position of the Nagulendran Chair in Peace Mediation. And Achim aims to demystify peace diplomacy as a professional field and to examine the sector's agency, assets, funding, and real-world outcomes. I think that we are privileged to benefit from Professor Venman's long-standing engagement with peace and mediation issues, both in research but also in practice. Dr. Venman has published widely on the political economy of armed conflict and peacemaking, on the role of the private sector in fragile settings, as well as on peace building in urban settings. On the side of practice, he co-founded the Peace Talks initiative as well as the Geneva Peace Week. Among many other activities, Achim Venman has advised the EU on the economic dimensions of the Yemen conflict. This was between 2020 and 2022. And he has collaborated with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue on urban peace efforts in Colombia. Before giving the floor to Achim, let me also extend a special word of thanks to Dorothy and John Nagulendran for their continued support, not only to this chair, but also more widely for initiatives at the Geneva Graduate Institute and beyond that help cultivate the very much needed boost for the next generation of peace leaders. With this, I have the pleasure to give you the floor, dear Achim.
Thank you very much, Gilles, for these words of welcome, and welcome to you all, of course, here today at the Geneva Graduate Institute and also online. Now, as you mentioned, Gilles, it's been over a year that I'm the Nagulendran Chair in Peace Mediation, and it's a very appropriate moment to take stock. I want to first start out with a number of things, particularly to colleagues at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, Interpeace, Amani Africa, the Muscat Policy Council, the Center on Conflict and Humanitarian Studies in Doha, and as well as the diplomatic academies of Oman and Qatar, and the many other colleagues that have met in that year, all of which are in one way or the other part of this presentation. We had many conversations that allowed me to get a much better sense of the current state of peace mediation and peace diplomacy, and therefore they provided the foundation of what you're about to hear. Of course, allow my thanks to John and Dorothy for their support, for the chair, and of course their support of this to this next generation of peace leaders, many of which are in my course. So thank you for that. Now, what I intend to do is to start out with a very brief analysis of the current strategic landscape of conflict, and then look into the key institutional dimensions, issues of agency, the assets that are really core of the peace sector, look at the funding and also the results that the sector produces. In the end, I would like to offer some reflections of future opportunities in this sector. As I'm taking stock here today, I would like also to emphasize what I'm not talking about, which is very much all the activities that are associated to a broader positive peace. What I will focus on today is primarily about the establishment and the maintenance of negative peace, so the getting violence out of political interactions through dialogue and negotiations and structured political processes. There are still many more years to go with the chair, and I don't think I need to do everything all at once, but I'll work on one thing after the other. Now, let's get started. How does the world of conflict look like today? And I think it's very useful to look at some key data. And here I presented some data of you that primarily draw on the ICRC, that states that there are around 130 armed conflicts being active worldwide. This is corroborated by the data of the Uppsala conflict database that looks at a historic high of 61 state-based armed conflicts globally. So there's a lot more conflict that we have today than what that we had just 10 years ago. And there's also more complexity because armed conflicts are composed of fragmented groups. They are multiplying, they're shifting alliances, and many conflicts are frequently intertwined. So complexity is up. As Gilles already mentioned, there is a protracted nature of conflicts, with many more conflicts taking longer and not really having a resolution in sight, which means that that trauma and violence becomes something of a systemic reality in many conflicts. If we are looking from a slightly different database at the reality of conflict, and we are looking at events data of conflict events, then we see this distribution of conflict around the world. There are around 200,000 conflict events that took place in 2024. And what I like about this analysis is that it gives you an assessment of conflict violence here aggregated to the national level, but also really sub-aggregated to the sub-national level. This is where ACLED is particularly useful as a database to give you a sense. So we are looking at a worldwide problem of conflict and violence increasing. And if we are looking at conflict events data, then we can say that conflictivity has doubled in just 5 years. Now, this is, of course, easy to say that conflicts are complex. But I think I want to perhaps take a minute to demonstrate the complexity with the reality of non-state armed groups, which is to say that the world is not just composed of states and of a sovereign world order. There is more. There is a hybrid world order, because politics in most cases is hybrid. And this comes out very nicely when you look at the world of conflict through the lens of non-state armed groups. According to the ICRC and the stellar work of Matthew Bamber-Zrit, who is a former fellow colleague at the Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building, there are 380 armed groups of humanitarian concern active globally. That's a lot of actors. And these are not just kind of weird bands of rebel groups. They have real territorial control. They have control over people. They control, according to this data, over 200 million people. They provide government services. They are imposing taxes and so forth. So understanding this hybrid political nature of armed conflict and also governance is, I think, very crucial as we try to make sense what is the reality that peace diplomacy has to confront with. But then also, to make it a bit more complicated, conflict is not the only thing. I will not go into this deeply. There are many, many other conflict drivers and insecurity drivers, such as pandemics, diseases, and the big wash list of different systemic factors. This is why a focus on conflict always has to be complemented by a focus of our time of radical uncertainty. Which means the time is radical because change happens fast and happens at scale, and it is uncertain because the present instruments that we have to deal with this new reality is not really up to the job. And hence, we need to reflect on what are the policy instruments that we have at our hand in order to deal with new reality. Some would argue the response is transactionalism, power politics. Yet others, like I would argue, we have to work more closely together with respect to dialogue and negotiation in order to solve some of the biggest problems of our world collectively. And peace diplomacy is, I think, a very good place to start. Now, I mentioned the word now already possibly 10 times. Why looking at peace diplomacy? And why not look at other concepts such as peace mediation? I would like to propose to consider peace diplomacy as an established professional sector. It is not an art or the product of some magical witchcraft. Peace diplomacy is conducted by professionals that are trained to prevent, de-escalate, or resolve violent conflict and manage crisis. I think this is very, very important to underline that this is a professional activity. Peace is not being left to chance, and peace is not being left to the unprofessionals. It's a professional sector. It represents a global network of access to people, to places, and to spaces that are necessary to shape the politics behind the ending of violent conflict and the building of peace. By framing the sector as peace diplomacy, we can also update our imagination of what diplomacy is in the current day and age. Because it is no longer just an activity of states. Many actors play roles on the pathway to peace, be that civil society organizations, business or faith-based organizations, or also academia. And so surely the current complexity of conflict is so big that no state alone can resolve the challenge of violent conflict, and surely should no one wait for states to start making peace. Now, from this more pluralistic perspective, diplomacy does not necessarily refer to the activities of states to manage international relations, but to the competence of dealing with people in a sensitive and tactful way, using the tools like dialogue, compromise, and persuasion. Now, by using peace diplomacy, I think we can also rehabilitate the work on mediation, because mediation is a distinct activity. And by a relatively sloppy use of the term over the last decade, where mediation has become everything, it is important to go back, in fact, to what mediation really means. And here I have put you one of the definitions that is standard in our field by Christopher Moore, that defines it as a very distinct resolution processes of which mediation is part. And by being clear of what mediation is, we can also look again at the other instruments of peaceful dispute resolution that are part of Article 33 of the UN Charter. So, placing and positioning peace diplomacy in this way allows us to construct a broader arc of support for conflict resolution and peace-building efforts, under which states, non-governmental actors, community-based actors, and many other actors can reinforce their complementary purpose and capacities for the achievement of peace. So much for some framing considerations, and for warming us up on our assessment of the peace diplomacy sector. Now, I first would like to look at the issue of agency, because I think it's important to remind us that when you believe in agency, you believe that human activity can shape a different type of future. And I think this is a core fundamental foundation of why so many actors are engaged in peace diplomacy and in this field, because there is that belief that human action can transform the future and that we can take an active part in shaping the direction of what this future should look like. Now, when we then have a look at who are the actors that are shaping that future and who has the agency to in fact do so, let's start looking at the level of states, the United Nations, and also an array of non-governmental organizations. Now, the list of states is long that is engaged in this type of work. In alphabetical order, we have, for example, Finland, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, Sweden, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the Vatican, of course, just to name a few. But behind this long list of states, there is a significant degree of variability, which I would like to briefly get into. When we look at Norway, for instance, Norway frames its work as contact diplomacy, of which the core idea is very simple. Peace requires talking to all sides, even when others won't. The rationale of contact diplomacy was put out very, very clearly in a report submitted to the Norwegian Parliament. And here the rationale is to provide for contact diplomacy is to provide links to key countries and actors, which is important in shaping Norwegian foreign policy and the promotion of national interests. End of quote. Peace diplomacy, contact diplomacy in Norway is not some kind of altruistic realization that Norway has an interest in global peace. It does, of course, but it does so by recourse to, of course, working on other national interests. What the white paper also emphasizes is that for Norway, it emphasizes the upside of contact diplomacy that can outweigh the disadvantages of isolating an armed actor. Here the report, and I cite, one loses both situational awareness and opportunities to influence when there is no contact, and there is a risk that isolation contributes to miscalculations and strengthens repressive elements internally. End of quote. This is the argument of contact, of engagement, of constant relationships to sometimes the most difficult actors in the world. Now, when we look at Swiss policy, we have a long history of good offices that many of you in the room, of course, know, that has to do with protection mandates, with host state services, and also with the mediation efforts that Switzerland engages in directly. With respect to the host state services, as Gilles mentioned, of course, we've seen a lot of activity on this just at the weekend here. When we are looking at Oman, we see yet a very other manifestation of peace diplomacy, which is much more part of a network-based security philosophy. This approach reflects the belief that national security is best ensured by cultivating strong, trust-based relationships with any actor capable of influencing Omani instability. It builds, of course, on long-held traditions within Oman, based on the religious traditions, and of course have been the foundations of Sultan Qaboos's foreign policy principles that reads that Oman should be friends to all and enemy to none. What has resulted is that Oman has become an interlocutor state. And it has been very, very useful in driving and very effective in driving discrete processes in this respect. Now, when turning to Qatar, there is yet another type of approach, which is described by the short form of mediation plus incentives, which is to offer very classic third-party roles in dispute resolution, but also offering investments in terms of development investments or private sector investments. This has made Qatar at the moment very popular with many for many conflict resolution processes, of which it maintains currently over a dozen at the same time, while it has almost as much in waiting to be taken on. Now, when we are comparing just these 4 different types of diplomacies, it becomes apparent that diplomatic cultures matter, because you have a relatively ad hoc, leader-propelled, entrepreneurial form of deal-making diplomacy that Qatar represents, and you have a much more structured, inclusive, bureaucratically supported diplomacy that is much more related to how European governments work in this field and also the NGO community. What is important here is to understand where is the bridge-building opportunity between these 2 types of diplomatic cultures, where there is a lot of mediation support competence currently available in Europe, and many opportunities for concrete dispute resolution that emanates out of the Gulf outward. Also part of the diplomatic culture differences is that in the Middle East, those involved in peace diplomacy are primarily coming out of presidential offices, out of intelligence agencies, out of security establishments, and sometimes also the foreign ministry. Whereas in Europe, primarily diplomats, and so foreign ministries of foreign affairs are responsible for peace diplomacy supported by NGOs. So you have also a very, very different institutional anchorage that is important to be recognized, that create their own challenges for collaboration across different countries for peace diplomacy. Now, there is, if you see this activity that happens in state, we can really say that today where the action is where the states are. And this has not always been the case, because after the end of the Cold War, the activity was primarily focused around the United Nations. However, today, the United Nations is much less in the center on peace and conflict dynamics. The reasons are many. There is no agreement on member states for the UN to play an active role, or for there to be any consensus on peace mandates. Also, in some parts of the world, the United Nations is being perceived as biased, and therefore it cannot act as a honest broker. And also, there are some regions in the world that prefer to use their own regional arrangements to work on their own conflict, of course evidenced by the motto, African solutions for African problems. Despite these facts, the UN remains indispensable for peace, because it is the only organization that has the membership of all countries in the world, and that is still the most effective insurance mechanisms for abuse of power for small states from bigger states. So I think for all of these reasons, it's very important to keep on investing in the United Nations system as a peace actor, particularly with respect to alliance building to regulate abuses from bigger states. There's also good news sometimes, as we've seen just at the end of October with respect to a new mandate for Western Sahara and the discussion of the 2007 plan for autonomy proposed by Morocco then. And of course, there are still extremely potent professional capacities that are particularly in the Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and its mediation support unit that represents, of course, a great pool of expertise relevant to infuse in peace processes. Now, when we look at the level of NGOs, there is a lot of actors, smaller actors that work from between 10 million Swiss francs a year to about 50 million. But there is a significant degree of difference between these actors that I will not go in here today in detail. But to say that there is essentially no one organization that is similar. Most of these organizations have a very tight degree of thematic expertise or geographic knowledge. But the importance that I want to highlight here is that as a collective, as a network, these organizations represent the asset of peace mediation support that has evolved over the last 30 years. And that is, I think, something extremely important to recognize, that because these organizations are also small, no one really sees them, but the collective behind these organizations is extremely powerful because it connects you to pretty much any armed conflict setting anywhere in the world today. Now, what if we now take a step back on this, from this notion of agency on states, the UN, and NGOs? There are a couple of topics I wanted to present to you that I think are important. And one is the reality of competition. Competition remains a key element that limits the sector, because there are so many levels of competition, particularly around money and visibility. So there is the competition between governments that compete for leadership. There is the competition between cities that want to host successful peace conferences and associate the name of peace to a certain degree of city branding. There are the dual rules of governments, which are both actors and funders, that of course generate ripples with other partners in the NGO and the UN sector. And then between the NGOs, the competition for funding can be relatively cruel and, I would say, relatively unpeaceful. And which is always the question, how organizations dedicated to peace can be so voracious against each other when it comes to money. Here, the motto in many organizations is that you fundraise or perish, which also, again, emphasizes a structural result of the funding competition, which only those conflicts that are fundable are possible to be worked on. And that leads to a whole degree of conflicts that remain forgotten to work on. Now, if we are looking at these dynamics, another important point to recognize is that there is a whole range of actors that is completely invisible in the current as an asset of peace diplomacy, which are those who work at the very, very local level, at the community level, in the barrios in South American cities, or in very far away border areas. Ultimately, in order to really understand the full breadth of the peace diplomacy sector, these type of actors at the local level need to be identified and included in our imagination of what represents a peace diplomacy sector. But let me illustrate this point very graphically. This is the classic understanding of multi-track diplomacy, where peace diplomacy evolves at the elite government level, at the track 2 level, as well as the grassroots level with society organizations. This came out of the multi-track diplomacy model that is there to expand places and spaces for building peace and making peace. However, in recent years, this pyramid has become a hierarchy, that there is a certain degree of prioritization of the track 1 level rather than the more societal grassroots type of activities. And the question mark I have here, if then is really the notion of a hierarchy, is if top-level deals are supposed to be a foundation for peace, then we might have a problem. Because then ultimately, where is the anchorage of this? And I think if we turn around the pyramid and we have not the grassroots and the local level as the foundation for peace, but the high-level conflicts, then you understand that pyramids have no degree of stability if they stand on their head. Peace processes that are only based on high-level processes will not be able to survive long. And this is why the current focus on elite peace deals in the Middle East and elsewhere cannot be stable unless there is a bigger involvement and engagement with localized peacemaking activities. And this goes back then to a reflection of what makes really the asset of which represents the value of the peace diplomacy sector. And here, I think we need to be very, very clear in order to identify that one of the core assets is the trusted relationships, access to the political spaces that matter for conflict resolution and crisis management, and also the capacity of the human resources who work in the sector to work in some of the most difficult areas, which I describe here as contexts of limited statehood. The understanding those who work in the sector, the human resources of the sector as a critical asset of the sector to build peace, to treat them well and to nurture a new generation of them is, I think, a very, very important element in order to identify what is valuable to be supported in the sector. This is why I'm also so honored to have this chair and to play a very little part in shaping a new generation of actors who work in this field. Every Monday from 14:15 to 4 p.m. And several of my students are in here. Okay, then, no assessment without speaking about money. And I think here we can both find some respite, but also we find challenge. I think when you look at the figures of 2023 and 2024, we can see that the sector is not in existential financial crisis, partly because the sector has not received too much funding from the US. The humanitarian sector and other sectors have been much more exposed to US funding, but the funding cuts primarily that affected the sector came from European donors. If we are focusing for the moment on the funding of the NGO sector up until 2024, we see that some European NGOs could, in fact, increase slightly their funding, where there has been some serious downturn with the one US-based organization, in particular Search for Common Ground, that has a projected drop in income of 40%, and Interpeace saw a sharp drop from about 30 million to 19 million due to the end of contracts and also to the donor environment. So there is some movement in terms of financing in the sector, but what we see is a relatively small, niche, boutique-type organization that can maintain a relatively manageable type of budget in order to produce targeted outcomes, which we will get to. When we go to illustrations of government funding, there is the government of Norway's Peace and Reconciliation section that runs roughly on a budget of 40 million. You have the budget in Switzerland dedicated to host state support and also to everything that is to support International Geneva's role as a host entity. But then you have governments that are supporting the implementation of their own peace agreements, such as the government of the Philippines and Colombia, that are investing multi-million dollars into the maintenance of these particular. If we look at the implementation of the Colombian Peace Accord, there are serious investments of about $12.5 billion over a 5-year period. So there is, one might say, some good news that the peace diplomacy sector has some degree of funding support, but it still needs to be alert on the funding side, because there are no real alternatives than governments to fund this sector at this point, and there is no real base in philanthropy or other private actors to fund this sector. Now, finally, let's come to outcomes. Because everyone always says, "Oh, peace is so intangible; it's hard to measure." But at least there's, according to one database from the University of Edinburgh, quite a fair degree of achievement, which is over a 10-year period to have brokered nearly 600 peace agreements. The interesting result here is that most of this activity is at the local context, in fact. Come again the notion that how important the localized dynamic is, and how also understanding the reality of micro-peace agreement as a real contribution of the sector. If we think about a report card of the sector, we not only have the nearly 600 agreements, but also a lot of intangible outcomes, which are the transformation of armed groups, and also then the many support roles in prevention, de-escalation, and the resolution of violence. One could say there is a lot of value for money in the sector because most of the results are being delivered on a relatively small budget. One should emphasize that the sector's, therefore the sector's efficiency, because it is essentially composed by small and nimble organizations that create very targeted outcomes, outperforms the security sector. And these are all elements of narrative to strengthen the utility of investment into the sector. Now, I think I nearly reached my half an hour, Gilles. Huh?
Yes.
So I'll conclude with several guideposts for strategic opportunities. So with a world where there's so much going on, I think the sector has to step back and think about how can it make the case to be attractive for investment, and how can it also demonstrate that there are new opportunities for peace diplomacy that so far have not been really worked on. I think the first thing to do would really be to make much more out of the tremendous human competence that exists in the sector. Ultimately, peace diplomacy is a human activity. And peace diplomacy is a human activity that recalls that peace is a constant human effort that needs to be maintained. And in the peace diplomacy sector, you find the individuals with the professional skills who can do this type of work. So concepts like brain trusts, of professional networks, expert pools, all of this will be very important to highlight the competences of the sector, and ultimately also to bring out some of the stories of the practitioners to inspire the new generation of what is possible through dialogue and negotiation. I think a next step also is to make the bilateral partnerships between countries such as Qatar and Switzerland, Oman and Norway, make these partnerships work. Because there is a lot of complementary competence between opportunity for access to real prospects for dispute resolution and the respective mediation support infrastructure that is necessary to resolve conflicts permanently and durably. Then I would emphasize one particular asset of the mediation community, which is that these are individuals that are as close as possible to the dynamics of conflict as you can imagine. They have contact to military commanders, military leadership of conflicts, so that they are at the very source of developing and of an understanding of what are the opportunities for de-escalation or peace. Now, in the current day and age, where many governments and make sense of conflicts, and they need to make sense of what is disinformation and what is real trusted information, having that access to information is really a key asset. And the mediation or the peace diplomacy sector should invest more into kind of elevators that bring this type of knowledge from the very conflict front line up until decision-making decision-making centers where the future of peace and conflict is being decided. Finally, I would also highlight one thing. There has been a lot of work that has been done to translate mediation and dispute resolution work into the facilitation of market development and pro-peace or peace-responsive private sector development in difficult contexts. This is a front line of associating peace diplomatic work with also business development, because for many of you who might have visited difficult areas, there is always business that keeps on going. And it is very important to find a new way of working in shaping a certain economic dimension upon which new livelihoods can be built, while at the same time designing the political systems that shape a more predictable political future for countries. So I think that intersection between peace-responsive private sector development as well as political work to structure political settlements in specific places is a very valued support. So far, my report back from the first year of being a Nagulendran Chair in Peace Mediation, there is much more to look at. This is a field of practice that is in great evolution. And I'm very honored with this chair to be able to have some degree of observatory function of what the key trends in this field might be. And everything that I might have missed, we can perhaps now address in the question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Hakim, for what has been, I think, a very substantive and rich overview in a bit more than a half an hour on peace diplomacy, peace mediation. You've been through first giving some conceptual clarity on the definitions of the key concepts and terms, but then you walked us through peace diplomacy, looking at the question of agency, assets, and then questions of funding, and also the question of how the market is organized. And I think you finished and ended your talk with provocative questions which are strategic for the future. So with that, I open the floor for questions. You can just raise your hand here in the room, and a mic will be there to accompany you. And I know that you can also ask questions directly online, and we have Pratit here, Pratit Singh, who will share with us any question that comes online. So I have certainly a question, but in the meantime, let me rather open the floor and see within the audience or online whether we have already a question for Professor Venman.
Hi, Professor. Rachel Sider. My question is about the link between agency and trends in the nature and shifting nature of conflict. And I'm wondering if you can speak specifically to whether, given the shifting nature of conflict, the agency or the culture that you described of certain actors is more or less relevant or more or less impactful given the trends that we're seeing, and whether there's actually potentially more agency for the private sector to be identified as an actor that has agency that maybe hasn't yet been acknowledged in that way, and what it would take for such agency to be understood and potentially leveraged.
Shall we take a couple of questions? So, please.
Many thanks, Professor, for your intervention. I'm Michel Anglade. You mentioned this point, which I think is very important, that this kind of elite peace processes are not sustainable. And we have seen this recently, for example, with Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where peace deals signed in Doha or peace deals signed in Washington have not changed the nature of the conflict in Eastern DRC. So my question is, what would be your suggestions to link this kind of elite peace processes with more grassroots peace processes? Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm David Lantz. I work for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is one of the actors in this peace diplomacy ecosystem Achim talked about. And I just wanted to thank you, Achim, for a fantastic lecture and just generally for being a critical friend to us. That's the best kind of friends that we can enjoy. Somebody who's an ally, but also who points to shortcomings and areas we need to invest in and improve in. So thank you for this. I have a question which relates to a kind of a puzzle that remains unresolved for me, having worked almost 20 years in the area of mediation. And that's the sector you're describing in many ways evolved in the 2000s, post 9/11. However, during that decade, there was a record low number of conflicts and fatalities. The numbers show this quite quickly, so you could say the need for mediation was lower during that period. And B, the kind of global discursive context was dominated by the war on terror, which, in many ways is an anti-mediation narrative, suggesting that engagement with certain groups that are tainted is not acceptable. And so how can we make sense of this puzzle that during a period that seems less conducive to mediation, a lot of the mediation sector actually has developed and grown?
So, Achim, I propose that we revert back to you, and provided you're to the point, we'll have time for a second round of questions.
I would love to hear more questions, so I'll be short and crisp. Look, Rachel, thank you very much for your question. Look, I think the argument for states and governments and secret services, security actors and presidential officers to be part of a peace brokerage arrangement is important for conflicts in which states, presidential officers and security sectors are fighting wars. Because here you have peers who are speaking to peers. And hence, the focus, particularly on some Middle Eastern conflicts on that level, is important because they have, to some extent, more leverage to work on a ceasefire and to work on reducing violence. Now, that is that's for a ceasefire, and I think this is again where we have to be very clear of what actor is leveraged into what. A ceasefire is not yet a peace process. A ceasefire is not a peace deal. A ceasefire is an agreement that we stop fighting in order, ideally, to speak on other things. And as soon as you speak on other things, then you get into multiple actors that have a rightful place in the discussion. And that also includes, I think, the private actors. Now, there is a long. This could be another lecture in itself, but I think there is still much more opportunities to think creatively, how to engage private actors positively in peace process negotiations and also in long-term war to peace transitions. But ultimately, and I'm turning here to Brian Ganson's research, of course, who's done years of research on the role of the private sector in peace processes. Work on peace from the private sector simply looks like good peace work, which means you consult widely across everyone who's involved, and you do not necessarily invoke your self-interest in peace to happen, but you invoke, in fact, your strategic abilities to leverage company resources in a specific area. So whether you are a mayor, whether you are a CEO of a company, or whether you are any other actor, there are certain ways in which you can leverage your role that you play as an actor within society, and that has to do with the way you shape dialogue and negotiation processes. Which brings me to the question of our other colleagues with respect to the linkage of track 1 and track 3. Look, I'm a big fan of the architecture of peace approach, where you can basically, there is no peace that can hold without a specific architecture that holds us. Political architecture, spaces for dispute resolution at different levels in society, and a very clear and transparent way who has the authority to intermediate. And then if one level does not necessarily have the responses for dispute resolution, what are the processes for the dispute resolution to be placed at a higher level? So architectures for peace, I think, are a very good way of framing these relationships there. But as I said, more attention to the grassroots level and more investment. David, thank you so much for your words, and I'm glad continue to be a critical friend, an enabling friend. And look, I think what I would say is that the anti-terror era allowed the mediation community to grow so much because I think there was simply so much work to do. Because some countries self-excluded their own ministries of foreign affairs or actors to connect to proscribed armed actors, and it was necessary to have an infrastructure that is connected to this line of work, and to deconflict certain areas, but to have channels of communication for all sorts of other things, for crisis management, for hostage releases, and so forth, which was important. But this could not be done by the countries at hand, and this is, I think, why you might have seen a lot of investment in this, because it was a very important discrete infrastructure that needed to be created. But we gladly can continue talking. Otherwise, we'll miss the second round.
Okay, so let's move maybe on the other side here. Yeah, question.
Thank you very much. Alison Joyner, representing NORAG, the Global Education Centre of the Graduate Institute. I'm very glad to hear your focus, Professor, on grassroots and the human nature of the activity that is peace diplomacy. And I'm particularly interested in the role of teachers and education institutions and communities that surround them in these processes. NORAG is about to publish on the 9th of December a policy insights on the so-called humanitarian development peace triple nexus, as the way of working for education in emergencies, particularly, but education everywhere. And I'd be really interested to hear your comment on where you see the role of schools and teachers in these processes of peace diplomacy, and then moving to the broader area, which you say you're going to move into in your coming years as in the chair of peace generation more generally in society. Thank you.
We have several questions here on the front with, I see 3 hands of young colleagues, maybe from German.
Hello, Achim. Thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. And my question would be, I would like to know if your observation on the whole overlooking of the grassroots and the diplomacy of peace, like that grassroots are being overlooked, if that's an issue that occurs mostly in general, then it's a conception that we have to change in peace diplomacy generally, or if it's something that occurs in non-democratic countries, and if so if this happens in Europe as well, because I mean, if we look at Germany or other actors that want to engage in peace diplomacy at the moment, I feel like that the overlooking of the grassroots is not just an issue of countries that are non-democratic.
You can pass the mic on the same row.
Hi, so thank you for the very interesting lecture. My question was what your impression is of the 28-point US peace plan that the US proposed regarding the Ukrainian-Russian war that is also being discussed right now here in Geneva.
And just behind, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. My question was, you mentioned wanting to encourage the grassroots and middle range leadership. Do you think that will in any way affect the UN and its role in peace diplomacy, especially with it losing credibility sort of, yeah, thank you.
And as we wrap up, Platit, any question online? No? So the last one, sir.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Wellman, for your speech and the landscape you have given us of this peace diplomacy. I appreciate that you mentioned civilians, diplomats and agencies, all civilians and not the military. Because I remember President Clemenceau said war is a too complex affair to be led to militaries. And I think today, with the development of very destructive weapons, it's not possible to have to wage a war without millions of casualties. Therefore, I'm asking you if there's not other ways with civilians to defend the country. For example, what Gandhi has issued, and also Lithuanian, with those people, civilians, just making intervention as civilians and civilian disobedience. Well, my question is could be civilian disobedience and civilian defense could be an alternative to military? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll respond the question from your question upward. Look, I think it's a very important observation which you make, because we are seeing currently in many parts of the world a significant peaceful mobilization of movements that have lost faith in traditional authority systems, and that have lost faith in their government's authority. We've seen already that this has led to protests from Sri Lanka to Bangladesh, to Nepal and to Madagascar and Tanzania. So there is something of a movement and civic mobilization building up, particularly in countries that have a very high proportion of young people. And I think there is something in there to think differently about what civic mobilization and civic mobilization means today, because these movements will, to some degree, create their own type of politics in the decade ahead. And at this point, we do not know if they just are going to capture old systems that we know don't really work, or that they are creating and create their own type of fused system out of traditional and more government-related models. So I think that's a place to watch for the type of civic peace space. With respect to the peace plan, the 28 points. I've mentioned this yesterday to a journalist of the Tribune de Genève. How good I can say just the same, because it's already published. It's a negotiation agenda. There is much more in there than just peace in Ukraine. There is the entire European security framework negotiations in there. There is nuclear disarmament in there. There are many, many, many other points in there. So it is a negotiation agenda where the Americans are exploring where is compromise space, where are there entrenched positions. And this is what Marco Rubio said yesterday evening here, this is an ongoing agenda. They've been negotiating already for the last couple of months. This is now a first time that they have articulated the collection of points in their entirety. And when you have a bargaining agenda, of course, you want to make sure that you can balance some interest and others, and so that you have something in there that is very important for Russia, and you have something in there that is very painful to Russia, so that you can balance it off. Calling it a peace plan is perhaps a little bit far-fetched, so I would rather call it a negotiation agenda. What else do we have? On the forgotten conflicts. I think there is really something. I think there is something to re-emphasize and focus at the community level, at the grassroots level, so to speak, because there are just so many conflict situations that are completely forgotten. One might say that are forgotten here in Europe, that are forgotten somewhere else. If you are living in Buenaventura, which is a port city in Colombia, you do not forget about the community conflict in which you live. So as closer to you are to a conflict, of course the conflict is part of your imagination. If you're living in Oman, of course the Baluchi conflict between the Baluchis and the Pakistan government is on your radar, because part of your family might come from this area. So the question, if we are thinking of forgotten conflicts or neglected conflicts in one way or the other, the question mark is neglected by whom? Which brings me to my point, is that if you want to find sustainable energy for peace diplomacy, you need to go to the people that are most affected. Because in any case where there is a lot of impact of war and conflict, there is always a degree of mobilization for peace. And this is where I have seen some of the most incredible agency for peace, which is at the city level with respect to gang violence, where even in the most incredible circumstances, there were leaders for peace to shape and broker truces with gang leaders or other types of engagements. So that would be my response to this. And this leads me to the response on the role of education. I think education is very clear. If you want to break cycles of violence, you need to start breaking the cycle through education. This is very clear with respect to community-based engagement on youth to try to prevent the dominance of gangs, to absorb young people. The same is done with Al-Shabaab and in other places. So, however, only doing education is not enough. You also need to work on other parts of the spectrum of the society that are impacting on the reasons for why gangs survive and why violence persists. But of course, as an educator, I would say education is always a good place to invest.
Thank you very much, Hakim. I think after just 1 year, it's really good to have you taking stock of what you have to share with us after 1 year holding the chair, and we can only look forward to coming back to hear what you have to tell us in 1 year time for your second year. Thank you very much. A big applause.
Thank you.